On to the 5-minute round, Mr. Couric for the Conservative Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We heard earlier that one of the witnesses suggested that if Canadians couldn't view their news online, they should simply go to the library. And it certainly sounded a little bit like a let them eat cake moment when it comes to the ability for Canadians to access content. And in a world in which, whether it's the devices we carry or the computers that we use, there's been a democratization of information that I think has been quite extraordinary, probably in the history of the world, although I think you can look back at different points in time and see other innovations. But certainly I hear from constituents all the time that are incredibly concerned about government overreach and wanting to control certain aspects of what that looks like, whether it's direct or whether it's indirect. Mr. Geist, in terms of Bill C-11 and C-18, you have one that has had a massive impact on Canadians' ability to see news content. And I've heard from many companies that would suggest that they just want to be able to share their content on those platforms and able to continue to get their content in front of the eyes of Canadians. And then you have C-11 that is kind of like this backdoor censorship idea that there's a mechanism for control within the bureaucracy. I'm wondering if you could comment specifically on those two pieces of legislation and the chilling effect that that has on freedom of speech and freedom of expression across this country.
We talked a little bit earlier about C-11, so let me focus for a moment on C-18. C-18 was predicted, and it was predictable, quite frankly, that if the legislation was introduced as is, it would cause a number of potential concerns. There was a likelihood that we would see blocking of news links, which is what's happened. It was likely that it would undermine trust, because if you find that there is more and more government regulation and government funding, I think it does run the risk of funding. Now, of diminishing trust. Now, with all due respect to my co-panelists here, the notion that we can solve all of this simply by more money to the CBC, or suggesting, with all due respect, that somehow Post Media owns 80% of newspapers and that's the problem, and at the same time note that now everybody has the ability to speak out. There are a lot of different sources, and if we only think about individual media properties as somehow having a monopoly on the news, then we're missing what is actually taking place right now, which is that there is a wide range of different sources. And one of the real harms that occurred with respect to C-18 was that it oftentimes excluded some of the more innovative players in the marketplace, and with a broad brush had the effect of excluding all of those players from major platforms like Instagram and Facebook.
So going to the library certainly isn't a solution. When it comes to C-11, the added bureaucracy and the CRTC, and I know you've written quite extensively about that, and how that level of control certainly is problematic in terms of Canadians being able to see that content, which there's this close connection between C-11 and C-18, which I know quite often the government doesn't like to see that connection made, but I'm wondering if you could comment on the C-11 side and simply Canadians being able to, while not be able to post content, the ability that it's limited in terms of what they can see.
11 hasn't stopped anybody from seeing anything online. The concern was on the algorithmic side as to whether or not, on the from a user content perspective, some content would be prioritized or deprioritized. Now, the CRTC just last week has launched new consultation that will focus on the meaning of Canadian content. We will see what it does with respect to discoverability, so it may prioritize some content over other content, and we may see that play out on some of these larger services. It isn't in the game of blocking particular content, though. There's nothing in C-11 that would move towards blocking of particular content.
Just in conclusion, has C-11 and C-18 had a chilling effect on innovation in Canada's mediascape?
Well, I think certainly, I think the answer to that would be yes, or at least from an investment perspective. When we look at C-11, the way the CRTC has begun to implement that law with basic mandated contributions, we've already seen increased prices for consumers. And we've seen some players that may look at the Canadian market and feel that the regulatory costs are too high. On C-18, I think it's even more significant, though, because if you lose one of your major distributors of your content, if there are no more links to your content through some of these larger platforms, this sends a signal that this is not a marketplace to invest in. And we've seen some of the larger independent players, Village Media, for example, stopped entering into new Canadian markets for a period of time out of concern. And the message that it sends to others who might want to enter into the marketplace by providing new, innovative news services is that this is a market where there are some of the regulations may inhibit the ability to have success in the market.
Start with Mr. Gourd for 5.
Thank you, Chair. My question will be for Ms. Foray. You said you have 30 years of experience in the field of journalism. Have you witnessed an evolution in terms of the freedom of expression over those years? Because in the last 30 years, I mean, was there something that you were able to say 30 years ago or in those 30 years and now you wouldn't be able to? Have you felt or have you experienced a kind of an evolution in that sense? Well, I think what's being said on the media outlets, it simply follows what's being said by Canadians at large. Personally, I think we have more broader access to media, to different types of rhetoric, because there are more sources of information. When I started in this field when I was younger, while you had 2-3 channels on the TV, you had a couple newspapers, that was it. But we felt that these people and the information coming from them, we could rely on them, we could trust them. But now we have more resources, but we're not always sure that what we are reading is true. So we need to be able to help Canadians understand what a real information source is, what is reliable information, and what they can have trust in. So because it happens often that people start trusting a source only to realize later on that what they've been consuming as information has not really been the truth. So we have to be careful selecting our sources. While you refer to ecosystems, public and private, but there's also a digital ecosystem over which there is almost no control, because in public and private, while you have people in charge, editors, etc., so there is more attention being paid to what's being pushed out, but in digital that's less the case. But of course, we have a lot of confidence in the work of professional journalists doing a good job. But if there is instruction, for instance, given to them, does it ever occur that they are not able to say what they think or what they feel like they should be publishing? Or maybe are they given direction? Or is it completely free? Well, I worked for a public broadcaster, but when you are working in the private sector, if you're not following, you're not doing what the boss is saying, well, your contract might not be renewed. That's the reality of working in the private sector. But when you work for the public broadcaster, that's not the case at all. You can say, you can reflect whatever the situation is, and you can do the work you want. So there is editorial independence in that sense. The last 10 years, I've had experience in the digital field. Well, it's the same thing. But in digital platforms, whatever is pushed out, it stays available. So if you want news to be reliable on TV and radio and digital, well, on the digital side, you need to be even more careful, because it's always out there. It's always going to exist. So there's a certain level of responsibility to make sure that, well, if you have said some things and those turn out not to be not true, you need to go back and make corrections. So reliable media it's also one of the hallmarks of reliable media, and it happens to everyone everywhere. No one is perfect, but when mistakes are made, you go back and correct those mistakes, and that's also how you can have trust in a media outlet, that they are reasonable and that they are reliable. So in the public sphere, a journalist that makes a mistake, well, they're told that they made an error because they said what they were thinking. Well, has there been no journalist at CBC Radio Canada who left to go to the private market and maybe they're happier on the other side? Well, I cannot really answer that question because I don't follow people. I would need to go out and ask the question specifically to everyone who has done the transition. But at work, of course, there are people who influence what we do. But when you have certain responsibilities in the public broadcasting side is to make sure that the facts are there and what is being said is true, that it's balanced. So you need to hear from all parties. You cannot just convey one single point of view, and the facts need to be included and the sources need to be checked.